in my column that there was trouble coming because of the excess debts of US households and the government, because particularly of what was happening in the US real estate market with subprime mortgages. Not many people had heard of subprime mortgages in 2006. And I argued that at some point there would be a shock, and the liquidity crisis that would result would cause as big a financial crisis as we'd seen in our lifetimes. That series of articles then evolved into the book The Ascent of Money, which was published just a few weeks before Lehman Brothers went bankrupt in 2008. So I think my track record was quite good. And if I look back over my writing in 06, 07, I was pretty much on the ball as to what was happening and how big it would be. And not many other people were. So pat on back, well done, Neil. What happened next was more remarkable, and I think I didn't read that so well. I underestimated the ability of the central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve, to counter what was potentially catastrophic chain reaction, first by cutting interest rates to zero, and then by engaging in quantitative easing, large-scale asset purchases. That policy was more successful than I expected in countering the powerful deflationary shock of 2008-2009. And one of its direct consequences was that all kinds of financial asset recovered in price. We didn't have a Great Depression. And people who held on to their stocks as well as their bonds, not to mention their real estate, were made whole remarkably quickly. So we can now look back and say, well, that was exciting, but we're now in a position where the US stock market is at a higher point than it was at its pre-crisis peak in 2007. And the same is true of real estate in most major cities. So it's almost like a bad dream, and everybody is now in a kind of cheerful mood, and they look ahead and they ask themselves, where should we invest next? Is Europe going to be the 2018 success story, or do we stick with emerging markets? And it's almost as if amnesia is beginning to set in. And that's the very moment at which I feel obliged to ask, well, what will the next crisis look like? Nobody can be exactly sure, but I think there are a few reasons to watch out. One is we can see it beginning with the Fed and the Bank of England, monetary policy tightening. And that is usually a sign that conditions are going to become less friendly. I think it'll take a little while for this really to feed through to stock markets, but this time next year, I think the world as a whole will start to feel the effects of this monetary tightening. Then you have the demographic forces at work. That's terribly important because we've lived through this period of a global labor surplus, and that's really coming to an end. And so labor markets are tightening. Some people think that will lead to higher inflation. I'm not so sure about that because I think there's an awful lot of structural deflation embedded in technology, but we can't be sure. We really don't know whether labor shortages will be counteracted by the construction of robots. And when I add these things together, what I see is at least the potential for a change in the global macroeconomic climate. And I haven't even mentioned politics. Add on top of that, populism of both the right and the left, the political uncertainty that Donald Trump alone has introduced into the international system, and the non-trivial probability of a war over North Korea. And I think we're entering a new period. Now, I'm not saying recession, January or February or maybe even December next year. I think we might even sail through next year without any policy reverse. But I think the probability is rising that there will be a fundamental change in financial conditions, and the higher political risk that I think we're seeing more or less everywhere is bound, I think, to weigh on assets sooner or later. So I'm not giving you a date to liquidate your portfolio, but I do think that we're entering a different period. The post-crisis period is over. We're entering in perhaps to a new pre-crisis period. It's impossible to say anything about the next economic or financial crisis except that it won't be like the last one. And the more regulation you dream up to avoid the last crisis happening again, the more certain you can be that the next crisis will be quite different and will come from some other quarter than US real estate and Western banks. The big question is China, because China's sustained growth was the other reason that we didn't have a Great Depression. If China hadn't done huge credit creation, I think would have had a much tougher time globally. It was the stimulus package that worked. But the results of China's great crisis-fighting policies are a very high level of debt. The emergence in China of some of the pathologies that we recognized in the West 10 years ago, shadow banking, real estate bubbles. And you have to ask yourself, as the IMF did just the other day, are China's big banks well enough capitalized to cope with what would happen if there were suddenly a downturn in the real estate market? So China's the place to watch. Of course, you know, economists have predicted 9 out of the last 0 Chinese financial collapses, and so I'm not about to add to the list of failed predictions, but I do think it would be much more likely to be China than the United States that was the epicenter of the next crisis, simply because China's debt level is so high, its growth rate is unlikely to be sustained above 6% indefinitely. The demographics have definitely turned against China, and the financial system has become so much more complicated than it used to be. I am skeptical that China's regulators are able to manage all these different moving parts the way they once were able to manage a quite simple state-controlled banking system.